And before that on BBC Two, a step back in time as schools programmes continue with primary focus history.
The houses we live in today have been built using the tools and materials that are available in the modern world. They're made of brick and mortar and other materials like glass and plastic. They have hot and cold running water and every convenience that we need to make life easier. But it wasn't always like this, because long ago people didn't have many of the things that we now take for granted.
In the past, people had to live much simpler lives. They had to use natural materials like mud and wood and stone to build and furnish their homes. In today's programme, we're going to find out something about how people used to live in the houses of the past.
To do this, we're going to visit the Ulster History Park near Gorchin in County Tyrone. Here, people can see full-scale models of houses and other monuments that have been built at different times. These exhibits tell the story of settlement in Ireland through the ages.
The Ulster History Park is about the settlement of people in Ireland from 10,000 years ago right up into the 17th century. So we begin that story then of the settlement of people in Ireland 10,000 years ago.
A visit to a museum like this helps us to learn about some of the people who have lived in this country over the past 10,000 years. It enables us to make contact with the ghosts of ancestors long dead. When the first settlers came to Ireland, they lived close to water, along the coasts and in the river valleys. They did this because the whole country was covered in dense forest, making it difficult to travel far by land. But the country was home to an abundance of wildlife, useful to early man. Herds of deer were a good source of meat. The rivers teemed with fish like trout and salmon. The hunters and gatherers caught them with spears and arrows tipped with sharp flint heads.
Hunters and gatherers were always on the move, so when food supplies became scarce, they would travel by water to another area. But even though they didn't stay very long in any one place, they still needed shelter from the wind and rain, so they made small huts. These huts were circular, just like the igloos that Eskimos live in. To make them flexible, branches were stuck in the ground and then curved over to make a dome shape. Other branches were then woven horizontally between them to make a strong structure. The branches were then covered with the skins of animals like red deer. Now, these huts were fairly flimsy, but they were ideal for the lifestyle of these people. The materials that they were made of were light enough to carry, so they could be easily dismantled and put up again very quickly in another place.
After a while, people's lifestyles started to change. They cleared forests to make fields, to grow crops and feed animals. They learned how to collect the seeds of wild grasses for food and how to plant these seeds in the springtime to make them grow into plants that could be harvested later in the year when they were ripe. They were learning how to cultivate wheat and barley. They tamed animals like pigs. They were learning how to farm. When people began to live a settled existence, they started to build permanent houses that were much bigger and stronger than the huts of the Mesolithic hunters and gatherers. These houses were square or rectangular in shape and provided enough space to house all the members of an extended family.
The walls of these sturdy dwellings were made of oak logs, cut into shape with stone axes and then set upright in trenches packed with stones. The spaces between the wooden planks were filled with mud to keep out the wind and rain. The house was then covered over with a sloping roof, thatched with reed or straw. Houses like this were built all over Ireland at the time. This one is based on a house that archaeologists excavated at Ballyglass, County Mayo. The inside of the thatched roof has been blackened by smoke coming from a fire that burned all the time in an open hearth. It was used for cooking and heating and formed a focal point for family life. The thatch of the outside roof is steeply pitched. The end wall is made of interwoven hazel rods and is supported by a heavy oak beam. The thatched roof is designed to let rainwater run away and thus keep the inside dry. In Ireland, as in other parts of Europe, these Neolithic farmers built stone monuments. While we will never know exactly what they were for, they are probably connected with their religious beliefs. During the Neolithic period, people buried their dead in stone graves like this court tomb. A court tomb like this had a forecourt at the entrance, which was usually at the eastern side. It's believed that funeral meals and other ceremonies for the dead took place here before the ashes of cremated bodies were placed inside the tomb. The ashes were placed in small chambers on either side of the interior of the tomb. The tomb itself was built of massive stones to form what we call a corbelled roof. To make the roof, the stones were placed on top of one another so that they get closer and closer together. This leaves only a small gap at the top to be covered with a capstone. Can you imagine what it must have been like to move rock this heavy without the help of modern machinery? Later in the Neolithic period, people used different techniques to build this sort of house. They still used natural materials like wood and thatch to build homes floored with earth. There was still just a hole in the roof to let the smoke out. The walls of these houses were built very differently. These walls were made of a double row of hazel rods woven tightly together, with the space between them filled with bracken or straw to help keep the heat inside. These wattle walls weren't as solid as those made of oak planks, but they did provide much better insulation. Plenty of insulation would have been needed to heat up this stone fort. It was built around the time of Christ on a promontory in the Aran Islands. These earthen rings mark out the bounds of another sort of fort. They are the remains of fortified farmhouses called raths. A ditch and bank topped with a wooden palisade marked the outer boundary of the rath. This provided protection from wild animals and hostile neighbours. Inside the outer defences, there was enough space to keep people and animals safe, close to the farm buildings and the family home. The houses were circular and sometimes had 2 rooms. The houses of this particular rath are based on some excavated near Glenarm in County Antrim. In troubled times, there was always the danger that enemies could break into the centre of a rath, so the family had to build a last line of defence. This came in the form of an underground passage, called a souterrain.
The entrance to a souterrain was often hidden inside a house. It led to a tunnel that was usually built by digging a trench that had walls lined with dry stone. The roof was made of larger stones covered over with earth. The tunnel ended in one or more chambers where people could stand or sit while they waited for their enemies to go away. While there, they could live on farm produce stored in the cool interior.
Souterrains had air shafts and extra defences, such as bends in the tunnels and low sections in the roof. They were the ideal place to hide while sitting out an attack by unwelcome visitors.
The existence of these secret passages point to tensions between different tribal groups that often led to conflict. Many years before, people had discovered how to make metal. They used their knowledge to manufacture weapons. These weapons could be used for defence or to attack others. Richer people who had something to fear started to build settlements called crannogs.
A crannog is an artificial island built in a lake. It's made of wood and stone and other materials held together by timber stakes to create a platform strong enough to support wooden houses.
The surrounding lake water formed a natural moat that protected the settlement, allowing everyday life to carry on in relative safety. You can walk straight onto this crannog, but in the past it wasn't so easy. Sometimes they were connected to the mainland by a submerged causeway, but often they could only be reached by boat. So they were a good place to live if you feared attack. Like other early dwellings, the buildings on a crannog were dark and smoky, but people tolerated these conditions as they practiced skills old and new. They learned how to make furniture on simple wood-turning machines. They used heavy stones to grind corn. They also had looms that were used to weave woolen cloth. This is Carrickfergus Castle on the shore of Belfast Lough. It's one of the best known sites in Northern Ireland, and it was built by the Normans when they came to Ulster in the early 13th century. The Normans were fierce warriors who conquered much of Ireland. They built castles as a defence against the native Irish. When the Normans first came to Ireland, they built their castles in wood, not stone. These castles consisted of earthen enclosures that surrounded high circular mounds. They were protected by wooden palisades and were known as Motte and Bailey castles. There were about 350 of them dotted all over Ireland. They were frontier fortresses and were strategically located to defend the newly conquered territories from attack by any of the native Irish trying to recapture their land. The buildings in these castles were usually made of wood and were much easier to build than those made of stone. The Normans were only one people who invaded Ireland. In the early years of the 17th century, settlers came to Ulster from England, Scotland and Wales. They were part of the plantation of Ulster. The native Irish resisted the plantation, so the settlers had to build bawns, another sort of fortified farmhouse. From inside their bawns, they could withstand attack. The outer walls of the bawn enclosed an inner courtyard. In peaceful times, this was used as a normal farmyard where the family could keep animals and go about their business in relative safety. In the event of attack, settlers from the surrounding area could seek sanctuary in the bawn.
The main farmhouse only had windows in the wall facing out into the courtyard. Now this open area was protected by high walls and corner turrets. The walls themselves were surrounded by a wooden gun platform, and defenders used this to fire their muskets down at anyone who dared to attack.
While the houses that the settlers lived in were fortified, they were also comfortable family homes. They didn't have electricity or any other modern conveniences, but they were laid out in much the same way as many of the houses that we live in today. The furniture and other household objects should be familiar to our eyes. Life was hard in the 17th century, but as the colony became more secure, people felt they could do without fortifications, and so were able to build houses in different styles. When people didn't fear attack, they could have bigger windows. They used heavy oak beams cut from local forests to create the basic frames of their houses. The best farmhouses had a room where a family could sit around a sturdy dining room table and eat food cooked on an open fire. In the familiar surroundings of their home, they could feel secure. Here, they could do what people have always done in their own homes. They could gossip about all the goings-on in their community and tell stories to help make the dark nights pass quicker.